skeptics have to be right all the time, but the UFO incident only has to be right once to prove them wrong.
Hey, this is Unrefined Podcast. Welcome to another episode.
Hey everybody, welcome to another exciting episode of Unrefined Podcast. This is Lindsay, very uncharacteristically doing the intro here, and I'm with my co-host Brandon Spain. Hey Brandon.
Hey guys.
So yeah, we've got a really cool guest today. You know, so far we've only had one guest from Mississippi, Brian Riley. I mean, do check out his episode if you would. And today we have another one. Today we have Pat Frascogna here with us to talk with us about the 1977 Flora UFO incident. So welcome, Pat. We're glad to have you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, Pat, we're excited about this interview because I live in Yazoo County and Lindsay lives in Humphreys. We wanted to do something kind of close to home.
I guess we can just start. Tell us about yourself.
Okay, well, I've spent my career primarily, as an attorney in the Jackson area, and I've been practicing law there since about 1990, 91. And along the way, don't ask me how, but I know how, but it kind of started with when I got married to my wife, Lisa. It turned out she had a cousin. And her cousin was a fellow by the name of Kenny Creel, who's from the Florida area. I think a lot of folks know Kenny.
Yeah.
And she told me of this event in 1977 of which he was a part. So that was the beginning of, you might say, a deviation from just practicing law to now practicing law / being a UFO investigator. So I was really intrigued by that case. And she still had family at the time. I guess she still does, living in Florida. And every now and then I'd get to kind of see those folks, that side of the family. And it was stories that were told about things that happened in the area. And certainly that was one of them. And usually with an admonishment not to ask Kenny anything because he didn't want to talk about it. So that's kind of where that side of things began for me, and have lived in that area most of my life. I've moved in the last year and a half to Texas.
Oh, okay. So yeah, you kind of married into this UFO incident here.
Oh, yeah, you could say that.
Yeah.
You could say that, sure.
So I guess just kind of set up the scene for us. Tell us about the Flora UFO incident.
Well, there are almost as many versions of it as there are people living in Florida, I guess you could say.
Yeah, we've heard.
Any of it. Well, it's not just Florida. I think that kind of goes along with almost any UFO incident.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are even varying accounts of what happened in Roswell, New Mexico, you know. But
yeah,
the general story goes as this. It was February of 77, and there were two police officers, one being Creel and one being a gentleman by the name of, I believe, James Ray Lute, who was a constable. I think Creel was with the Madison Sheriff's Office. And they would end up, they were on, I guess, some kind of patrol together. I'm not sure why the constable and a sheriff's deputy were in the same car, but evidently they were, as I understand it. And they would end up seeing a circular craft with, I believe there were portholes of some sort in it, which is kind of reminiscent of the Betty and Barney Hill incident up in New England at about the same time or earlier, actually.
Yeah.
They they would see this object hovering in the sky, evidently not that high up, maybe within 100, 200 feet, if that high. And the area that I recall, it's been, guys, you'll have to help me a little bit. It's been about 10 to 15 years since I last did some traipsing around the area up there where things are. I want to say there's a highway that goes out from 49 past what used to be a Ramey's grocery store, heading west. And I think it ends up maybe in Edwards or somewhere like that.
Yeah. It goes past the petrified. I can't remember the number of the highway.
I can't.
But it
either.
goes by It goes through a subdivision and goes to the petrified forest.
Yeah, and there's some cattle farming, I think, out that way as you first start off and so forth. There is a home. We're talking now. You're probably. I'm just going to guess 10 miles down that road. When it starts to curve to the left, and I think locally it's referred to as Grant's Curve. Probably because of a family living in a house. It's right there, and it was just past that curve, as I understand from the folks that showed me, is where this object was seen. And even though it's grown up with trees now, at that time, I believe it was a cotton field or something. So it was actually pretty wide open, being able to see. So they would end up in close proximity to it. I've heard that it passed near them, that it passed over them, passed by them, just about any preposition you can think of, I guess, on whatever. And they could see it. And of course, it was quite evident that it didn't look like anything of ours or theirs. It was something exotic, something unusual.
Hey, my unrefined friends. I just wanted to tell you guys that I am so thankful that you are my life. Some of our best fans have been writing to us, and I just so encouraged about how lives are being transformed and people are getting something out of this podcast. I mean, that's what it's all about. That's why we're doing this, is to glorify Jesus and to just look at the world and have a more open view of the seen and the unseen and the supernatural in the world. So while we're doing that, we're going to handle all different kinds of topics. But see, what I'd like for you to be involved in or part of is our members only group. Things that are coming in our members only group that are going to just blow your mind. Not to mention, there's going to be episodes in there that you won't be able to hear just on the normal episode channel. So make sure to visit our website at unrefinedpodcast.com and check out our members only community. I just can't stress the fact that, we're after building a community, and there's so much out there, you guys, and there's so much coming. I really believe we need to build these strong communities of Christ followers to be able to handle what might be coming in the future days. We're sure that you'd be a good fit, and we cannot wait. I can't wait to see you there.
Supposedly was making some noise. I believe it's often described, you'll hear this in other reports, of like a laundry and dryer. The dryer is off balance as it's rotating out of a sound. It's not the first time that kind of sound's been reported, by the way. So little clues like that kind of make you think, and this is certainly an age well before the internet. So people weren't able to just get information like that from other events readily, is what I'm saying. It would end up passing off. If one of the witnesses, I won't mention his name, he always seems to be a little nervous about his name being mentioned, but he shows up a lot with his identity not being revealed on camera in interviews and such. He told me, I believe, it passed off going to the north, slow rate of speed towards, is it Bentonia? That's just...
I heard Satarsha.
Satarsha. Okay, that's...
Yeah. So that's where Brandon actually lives.
Yeah, I live in Satarsha. Yeah.
And then it would end up disappearing over the horizon or over the tree line, more likely that way. And so there were it wasn't like any kind of, close encounter of the fifth kind or anything. It was just, nobody was seen in the windows peering out or walking around on the ground. I don't believe from my research there was anybody that mentioned lost time. It was strictly a visual event and audible too, I guess, with some of the sound. I would end up talking to several people. Of course, this would be many years later, 2010.
Mm-hmm.
And one was a Younger. Younger is his surname, last name. He was a highway patrolman that was in the vicinity. Because before this would all end, supposedly there were upwards of 50 people at Grant's Curve that had assembled, watched this thing. And off it went. And then all those years later, when I'm trying to speak to people, most folks didn't want to go on camera, didn't want to have their name, so on and so forth. And so the incident is curious for a lot of reasons, but, one is, what was the object doing there? Of course, we don't know when and where they show up, other than we do know in cases like the Rendlesham Forest incident, they are often affiliated with military installations and also power plants. And so, but at that time, Flora didn't have anything like that, except for the old disused ordnance facility out at, what's the name of the park there?
Kearney Park.
Thank you. Kearney Park. So that's the story in a nutshell. And the gist that I got from talking to people was something happened. Something was odd. It was not anything of ours. Although at that time, this is 77, you have to remember, people were still very much, not completely, it started to erode by this time, certainly, but there was still a lot of that post-World War II confidence in what the U.S. government told you. And that being the gospel truth, and we don't have anything close to that now in our society, but back then we still did. I had heard from other parties that Creel had spoken to, I believe it was Bozeman was the sheriff at that time, and he had supposedly, talking about Creel, had been contacted by either Men in Black or folks from the Air Force or whatever it was, and told to keep quiet. So that essentially is the Flora 1977 event. What's interesting about it is it was not the only one in Mississippi that year that made headlines. There was another one down around Taylorsville that only got about one article in the paper, in the Jackson paper. And it was also in 77. And it also was very eerily similar to what happened in Flora. And I have the good fortune of being able to run down and talk to one of the only 3 witnesses to that event. This is a former Vietnam helicopter pilot, and who has since passed. And it was really something to hear his take on what he saw that night outside of Taylorsville as it compared to the Flora.
Yeah, I was going to say, did you know anything about? I read something about it, something that happened around that time in JS, Mississippi, down in Lawrence County, I believe. A similar occurrence.
You'll have to tell, what county are we in if we're outside of Taylorsville? I can't remember.
Taylorsville's in Smith County, I believe.
Okay.
So, yeah. Brookhaven also there were calls into the municipal airport around that time about UFOs.
Well, I don't recall if it was 77 was kind of a hot year for UFO sightings around the country, and Mississippi certainly wasn't left out of that. There's another event up in Columbus where an object supposedly appeared over a high school football game and seen by a lot of folks. And so it was a big year. Things were going on. And I believe if we go to Pascagoula, what year was that? The famous Pascagoula.
73, I
Yeah,
think.
a little bit earlier then. Yeah. 70s were a good time for UFO sightings in Mississippi.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder what's so significant about 77. I mean, I was only 3 at the time, so I don't remember it, but I wonder what was so significant about that particular time period. What was going on, Pat, in the world, that would you think would be causing all these sightings?
I don't know, but that's something that's a good idea of something to research, piece it
Yeah.
together. Um,
Mm,
I've had a good friend of mine, I'm sure all of you have seen him on TV many times, Nick Pope, who used to be with the Ministry of Defense in Great Britain. He and I have talked many times about this sort of thing and, bringing parallels, together of what was going on. Was there, for example, a lot of nuclear testing going on, by the
mhm.
U.S. atomic test? I know there were 3 atomic blasts, subterranean blasts down around, just southwest of Hattiesburg. I don't remember if they were that year or not, but I believe they were in the 70s. And so it's entirely possible that that was what drew something close, because atomic testing, atomic facilities, atomic weapons storage areas all have a higher percentage of sightings than anywhere else. So,
Well, and
Mm.
2, correct me if I'm wrong, Pat, this is the part of the climax of the Cold War. I mean, it had started obviously back in the 60s and even after World War II, but I think the 70s and 80s were like the climax of it. What wasn't it?
you'd be correct. There was certainly a lot of testing going on in Nevada in the 50s and 60s, but it certainly was still going into the 70s. And like I said, Mississippi actually, one of 3 states that has had nuclear or atomic tests, conducted blasts, and I had to look that up. I can't remember, but I believe those were in the 70s. Well, and albeit subterranean, but still, if that is what's you know attracting something through whatever means, whatever it is that is detected, whether it's underground in the atmosphere or at the surface, it still produces um, radiation and other things that can be picked up.
I wonder if that test was in Vicksburg. Was it at the Waterways Experiment Station in Vicksburg? Is that where they had that
No,
atomic test?
it was at you go down 49 out of Hattiesburg. Well, it's I'm gonna have to look it up. It's not far. If you're leaving Southern Miss, University of Southern Miss, might take you 30 minutes to get there. Um,
Bluesdale?
I believe that's it. I believe that's it. It's the Tatum Salt Dome, I think, is where they were doing the tests. Um, and it had surface effects. Supposedly knocked cattle, off their feet. Uh, Families in the area fell, and so it wasn't like it was just underground and nobody could feel anything.
Hmm.
And few people know that, except for perhaps those that live down that way, that there ever was atomic testing in Mississippi, but there was.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I really didn't. So, okay, so Deputy Creel changed his story later, and I think he may have even from the WAPT story on this said he kind of made it up or something like that. Why do you think he changed his story?
Well, he changed. Well, I can't speak for certain as to what he,
Right.
I don't think, from my opinion, is that I don't think the guys made that up to begin with. And there
Mhm.
were other witnesses as well. So, but certainly at that time in the US, um, the government did not want anybody poking around that topic,
Yeah.
um, unless they were approved to do so. I mean, this is what's going on right now. We're in the middle of it, which is, I think we're a little bit past it, but we're still in the phase of legitimization of the topic. what's going on now in Washington with hearings that they've had the last couple of years, uh, release of these films like the Navy and so forth. And I know, in fact, I know several people that are involved in that effort. They're trying to legitimize it, okay, because they need more brains working on this, for one thing. When you have what they've been trying to do is a very siloed kind of effort. So what you're doing in building 101, you can't know what they're doing in building 102. But if you could join together and know what each other's doing, you might make some breakthroughs. At that time, the U.S. certainly wasn't doing things that way. So I think it's hard sometimes for a lot of people, younger folks, to realize what's going on now is the total opposite of what it used to be. And as far as trying to bring this out into the light of day. And so back then it was nothing more than, I think he just was, he was informed that he needed to shut up. And so that's what he did.
Hmm.
Well, that reminds me of, we just did a episode on MK Ultra, and a lot of people nowadays don't realize how compartmentalized the government was back then. Like you said, that you know, the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing, and even early NASA and Air Force stuff, they were all kind of kept in the dark of what the other branches were doing. And yet, and nowadays, yeah, you're right. It's I think it's because of just technology. You can't. It's harder for them to hide stuff. I mean, is that what you would think, Pat? It's harder for them to hide it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it. But I mean, I think what's driving it is a fear that other nations will figure out something, because just like David Grush, who's been in the news, he's a fellow I've spoken to before, and very nice guy, and everything they say about him on TV is pretty much accurate. I mean, he's a stand-up guy. He's the so-called whistleblower that's come out and said some things about craft being, you know, held here and there across the country. And he's not the first one I've heard that from people who were in the know. And so the problem is simply this, that compartmentalized approach has not worked insofar as figuring out, creating alien reproduction vehicles or just reverse engineering, simple components. It's not worked. And so if it's going to ever work, you got to have more minds collaborating. And the fear is that another nation will figure things out before we will, because we were too worried about, bringing the public into the know and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's essentially it. And then in the background of all that, I'm sure, is money in the term,
Always.
form. Yeah, of course, in the form of appropriations for research and blah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's really quite simple. I don't think it's as complicated as some people think it is. It's just, some have suggested that are in the know that we might have been, we might have fallen behind other nations. Other nations are actually a little bit ahead or a lot ahead of us in figuring out certain things. One gentleman that I know, who y'all, I'm sure, seen his name before if you ever do any reading on the topics involving Roswell. And I asked him, I said, well, this is when I was still somewhat of a skeptic. I kind of entered all this as a skeptic, 10, 15 years ago. I wasn't sure about the topic. I became a believer along the way. And I asked him, I said, I think it's kind of fortuitous that whatever crashed at Roswell just happened to have technology that was not too advanced that we could understand, we could unravel, because there's been a lot of talk through the years about things that have come out of that craft. And he gave an interesting answer. He said, well, there's still a hell of a lot more that we don't know what it does.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of sums it up. And that's where we are. We're trying to figure out some things that we don't think we're going to be able to figure out if we continue with a compartmentalized approach.
Mm. It's interesting. You said at some point you became a believer. Could you tell us what that point is, or was it more of a gradual thing? Or
I don't think it wasn't like a bright line point, I crossed from here to there. It's just been, I've been fortunate to be able to talk to a lot of folks, many of whom you'll see on the news that are talking about this. And so I've heard them, firsthand, um, over drinks in a lounge at a hotel in Washington or, you know, in Tucson, Arizona or wherever. And then I've on the phone and then just being part of group conversations, talking about something to do with whatever. And after about, 10 years, you figure if these people are lying, they're really committed to the lie. I mean,
mm,
because it, what they're saying, it makes sense. Many of these people are not really doing anything for personal gain, you know. Um, the ones that I tend to be the most wary of are those that make this into entertainment. Like people,
mhm.
I get calls all the time. Man, if you watch that latest Ancient Alien, and it's like, yeah. Well, keep in mind, those kind of shows sensationalize a lot, and so it's like it may not be that it's not true, but they kind of get you to focus on something that may not actually be the key to it all. But it's I just over the years, I mean, I've just been around too much. I even got to hold a piece of the Roswell craft.
Mm.
Um, that didn't do it because I
Wow.
was still very much of a skeptic at the time, and I thought, yeah, well, that's what they say. This
No.
I don't have an electron. I don't have an electron microscope here to do any kind of.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to butcher a phrase here probably, but it goes something like the skeptics have to be right all the time, but you know
Oh yeah, I know what you
the
mean.
UFO incident only has to be right once to prove them wrong. I mean, when the evidence piles up, you just at some point you just got to say, is my skepticism just stubbornness? And I find myself saying that a lot of times.
Or echo chamber.
Yeah, oh, very much so. I mean, I'm 61 years old. I can remember very well back when anybody that talked about this, it was kind of like, oh yeah, well, you go have fun reading fiction or doing whatever. And people like my son, who's in his 20s, you ask him about it, and it's like, well, of course there's aliens. You know,
Hmm.
complete reversal from where we used to be.
Hmm.
Unbelievable.
Well,
So
Pat,
I go ahead.
I have a I have a question for you. You were talking about the shows like Ancient Aliens and the sensationalism and all that kind of stuff. What do you think about it? Because this relates to that. What do you think about the Greer guy that takes people and calls crafts up on at different locations? Isn't it his name Greer, like Steven Greer, Steve Greer?
Yeah, Steven
Am
Greer, I
I?
think.
Yeah. What do you think about that, Pat?
Steven Greer, I have not actually met Steven, but I've been at conferences where he's been. Um, Steven's kind of an odd one. Because I know of some people he's interacted with that are actually quite serious,
Hmm.
about things, and not to say that he's not. I'll put it this way: Steven is he's got a knack for the sensational. Um, I think he's got a knack for performance, and I think he weaves that in a lot of times with what he does. But that doesn't necessarily mean that what he's doing is, not meritorious on its
Hmm.
own. But again, I tend to try to not steer, completely away from entertainment in this area, but because it is fun, much of it, to watch or listen to um, storytelling kind of podcasts, that kind of thing. Um, but it's, I, look, he's a physician, I believe, in North Carolina. He stepped out to get into this. I got to give him respect for that.
Hmm.
Much like is it Lynn Katai? She's a cardiologist out in Phoenix. She's done the same thing since the Phoenix Lights. So I've met her. And so, anybody with a PhD after their name or an MD after their name, or I guess in my case, even a PhD, when you step out like that, before they started to legitimize this, and certainly Greer's been on the playing field since before this was becoming a legitimate topic, you have to give some respect.
Hmm.
And credence for what they do.
Yeah. Well, could I ask you to just give us your opinions, speculations? I got to ask on what you think the object in Flora was.
Well, I was told once by a gentleman in the military that I had the good fortune of getting to speak to, who's retired, who's in the know. And he said, don't be so quick to make these, don't, how did he put it? It's been years ago. He said something to the effect of, it's not so simple as just being not so simple as just being spacecraft in the sky. So in other words, when you see something or like Flora was that a spacecraft with some kind of biological, entities, in this case, extraterrestrial biological entities, EBEs. Sometimes you'll hear that acronym used. And the point he was making was expand your thinking. It's not necessarily a craft that took off from a planet across the galaxy. Okay. It could be, and I kind of think this is more so where things are going, and eventually will land as far as revealing, and that is, they're craft, they're physical craft, just like Flora, just like the Tic Tacs, and Catalina Channel of California with the Navy and the so forth. Yeah, they're physical craft. They may or may not have, life forms in them. They may just be, robotic drone type stuff. But the place they came from isn't even in our universe. It's in another universe. That's what he was trying to tell me. Some people would call that dimensional.
Yeah, interdimensional beings.
Right. And so that was kind of an eye opener for me because I thought, I'm going around patting myself on the back privately, thinking, man, I'm really on the vanguard in my thinking out here. And then it's like you have a guy like this say, that's great. You're thinking that way, but you're really not thinking big enough. So that's kind of the way I felt about it.
Let me ask you another question too. This is kind of a multi-layered question, so bear with me here. Have you heard of Project Bluebeam before?
I've heard of a lot of projects. Bluebeam.
Yeah,
I'm not
Bluebeam.
sure I've heard of Bluebeam.
Okay,
Tell me more.
Basically, Project Bluebeam is this belief that the government has and I think there's some real validity behind it. I don't think it's just conjecture or a quote conspiracy unquote. However, that the government has this plan of faking UAP, or I prefer UFO. I don't like UAP, but UFO or UAP type situations, and that at different times in our history they were going to do it. Like for one example is they were going to do it in the Middle East and say it came from Allah, and they were going to use some type of manipulation or mind control to cause the Muslims to do this, that, and then there's been other speculation in different areas. And so this, if you get a chance, Pat, it's an interesting rabbit trail to go down to investigate. Uh, the reason I was asking you that I was wondering if you think possibly that there's like two things going on. There is these legitimate extra dimensional beings that are out there that are doing stuff, but then the government also has its own plan of a manipulation to try to do. I don't even know what the agenda could possibly be, but to manipulate and make people think that there is a uh, um, UFO UAP thing to kind of gain control. Because I mean, the government is ultimately, and this will give you I'll play my card of what I think about the government. The government is ultimately about control, you know, and so uh, anyway, I'm sorry you know what Project Bluebeam is, so that kind of, I guess you can't answer too much on that.
No, I think I can. I'm familiar
Okay.
with a paper. I think it was written. It's one of those. I think it might have been a CIA sponsored uh, project this research paper produced. The Iron Mountain Report, I think, is what it was called. And basically, that had to. They discuss in that paper that war is necessary every so often for mankind to rejuvenate itself, basically clear out a lot of garbage, in society, make it focus itself, much like World War II did to the United States, and bring about a stronger population, a stronger society that will last only so long before you got to have the next war. So that kind of reminds me of that when you bring that up. First thing I'd say is, hell, we're sitting here talking about aliens and recovered craft and so on and so forth. So why not would be my first reaction. I think it's certainly possible. But I call me a bit of a cynic, but I just think money governs everything. And money is the big carrot that's always out there. And that's what people are going to pursue. And so I think this part of what's pushing this agenda now is this is a great vehicle to approach, the purse strings and say, hey, we need money for this. We need lots of it. And by the way, if we don't get it, Russia may get there first, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that sounds familiar. Like like Kennedy back in the not necessarily Kennedy, but like in the Kennedy era. We need money to go to the moon before the Russians get there.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
That's a great example. Yeah, and so that would be. I guess what I'm saying is, before I would believe there was a great conspiracy to accomplish what you're saying Bluebeam talks about, I would believe that it's a little simpler than that. It's not as complicated. It's more about just the basics of what drives humans to do what they do. But I say that I want to emphasize and I do know a lot of good people that are involved in this effort to bring this stuff to the fore. And again, going back using a guy like Greer. Now, I may be wrong. Steven may have come up with a business plan, said, hey, I'm going to start producing films and I'll make money. I don't know. But still, I think he was running a big risk, being in the profession that he is, and all of a sudden appearing on TV talking about things like this again, before the legitimization of the topic was years before it would begin.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I guess we can kind of begin to land the plane here. With this question, have you personally had any, we ask question along this lines. Usually Brandon asked it, but we ask all of our guests if they've ever have a story, like a personal story, the supernatural, the paranormal, etc., that has personally happened to them.
Um, well, I guess it's my first reaction to that might be what I could say. Well, that's kind of personal,
Yeah.
Um, but uh, the answer is yes, I have. I mean, when I was a child, um, actually, two things have happened to me. But when I was a child, about 10, 11 years old, maybe 12, um, me and some neighborhood friends who were outside in the afternoon late one summer afternoon, meaning the sun had gone down, but it wasn't dark yet, Uh, we saw something that was luminous, that was in the sky, that was not the moon, it was not the sun, and it was not a plane approaching, on approach for landing. That to this day, every now and then, every few years, we might bring that up and say to ourselves, what the hell was that?
Mhm. Yeah.
And we still wonder what it was. Um, I would then, I speak about things being private. I have another uh, something that happened to me. It's very personal, but I was, I sought out a author, guy named John Geiger, like Geiger counter
Hmm.
from Toronto. He was written a series of books on something called third man factor. Have you ever heard of that?
I think I've heard of that, but mm,
Um, and because I had an experience some 10 or so years ago and unrelated to UFOs, and I became aware of him because I saw a NASA astronaut talking about his experience that Don had recorded for him on, memorialized in a book. And I said, well, I want to talk to him and see if I'm crazy or if there was something to it. Anyway, so um, my story ended up in a book, one of many that he accumulated for a follow-up book to Third Man Factor. Third Man Factor is it began the first recorded incident I think that Geiger found in doing his research quotes was I can't remember the Antarctic explorer from 100+ years ago. His ships got frozen in the ice. They had to abandon them and walk. And he and his crew. And essentially, when they finally were rescued, they each learned that they had each had a companion with them
wow.
during that. And it's fascinating. Anyway,
Yeah.
that has been replayed in many ways in the stories. You'll see that he's collected from people who have been in car accidents or trapped underwater or so forth.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I just looked it up, and what I'm reading now, it's an unseen presence or spirit and provides comfort or support. So they're generally viewed as benevolent beings,
Yes,
whatever they are in this experience.
right. And some people's, because of their faith, they might see him as angels, or
Hmm.
or they see him in, like in my case, a familiar person. So but that it's past someone who's known
Was it
alive.
was it was Shackleton the guy you're talking about? Was it Shackleton?
Shackleton,
Yeah,
Admiral
Ernest
Admiral
Shackleton.
Shackleton.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah,
It's
we
a very
appreciate
very
that.
personal story. We appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, thank you.
So, well, good. Perhaps we can have another meeting sometime. I'd love to introduce you to one of the principals from the Rendlesham Forest at
Yeah,
Dunbury.
for sure. We'd love
Yeah,
to
we would
have you
love
back.
that. Yes,
Well,
absolutely.
because John and I got the way I met John was due in large part to the fact that there was a UFO over Flora in 1977. That
That
would be
started it
linked.
all.
Well, yeah, I mean, the way we would come together to link up to an event that occurred in England in 1980. So it's interesting how things, they plug in from one to the next,
Yeah.
connecting.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you one thing, Pat, that I've learned through all this is I don't really believe in coincidence too much anymore.
I don't either. I don't either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Pat, man, this has been a great show. We really appreciate you coming on and sharing your knowledge with us, and looking forward to having you back. Thanks so much. And thanks to our listeners, as always, for checking us out. How can people follow you?
Probably the best way right now. I don't do too much. I do speaking engagements, conferences, MUFON. I was in Las Vegas for their conference, and every now and then John and I get to appear together, and John Burroughs. Best way is probably just through Facebook. You can message me there, and we can, go from there.
Yeah, we actually had a MUFON guy from Canada on our show.
Yep.
I don't know,
Nathan
a while
Zieber.
back. So, Nathan Zieber. Yeah. So
Fantastic.
yeah.
Good organization.
Yeah.
Again, thanks, Pat, for coming on, and thanks to our listeners. And join us again for the next episode.
Thanks for listening and supporting us. And remember, stay naturally supernatural.